An avoidant doesn't pull away because they don't understand you, they pull away because you explain too much. This is one of the most misunderstood dynamics in avoidant relationships. Most people believe distance happens because they failed to communicate clearly. So they respond by doing the one thing that feels responsible, explaining more. They soften their tone, choose better words, revisit the same feeling from every angle, hoping that clarity will create closeness. But with avoidance, clarity isn't comforting, it's overwhelming. Avoidance feels safest when emotions remain abstract, when connection exists without demands, and intimacy doesn't require presence. The moment you begin over justifying your feelings, over clarifying your needs, or emotionally narrating your inner world, something subtle but critical happens. You remove the pressure for them to engage. You do all the emotional labor for them. You carry the weight of the conversation alone. And from their perspective, there's nothing left to respond to. Over explaining doesn't invite understanding. It signals anxiety. It tells the avoidant, I need you to get this because I need reassurance. And that need, no matter how calmly expressed, activates their deepest defense. Avoidants are not afraid of emotion itself. They're afraid of emotional responsibility. When they sense that your feelings require their participation, they instinctively retreat. This is why boundaries cannot sound like emotional essays. Boundaries are not stories. They are not explanations. They are not pleas for empathy. Boundaries are statements. Clean, grounded, fine. You don't say why something hurts. You don't relive the moment. You don't connect it to your childhood or your attachment style or how much you care. You simply say what will change if it continues. That's it. For example, instead of explaining how inconsistency makes you anxious and why reassurance matters to you, you state, I don't stay in connections where communication disappears without explanation. There's no accusation there, no emotional overflow, just a line drawn quietly in the sand. And this is where the power shifts. Most people believe explaining is how you get someone to choose you, but with avoidance, explaining gives them an exit. It allows them to disengage emotionally while still feeling justified. They can say, I didn't know, or I'm just not good at this, and walk away without confronting the real issue, whether they are willing to show up. When you stop explaining, the avoidant loses their favorite escape route. There's nothing to debate. Nothing to minimize, nothing to reinterpret. They are left with a simple reality: meet the boundary or lose access to you. And this is the truth most people miss. When you stop explaining, you don't become cold, you become clear. You force the avoidant into a position they avoid at all costs: choice, emotional presence, or emotional loss, engagement or distance with consequences. There is no middle ground anymore, no hovering in ambiguity. No half connection sustained by your effort alone. At that point, avoidants do one of two things. Some step up, not dramatically, not with speeches, but with behavior. They adjust, they lean in just enough to maintain access, because now connection requires participation. And others silently begin stepping out, not because your boundary was unfair, but because it revealed something uncomfortable. They never intended to meet you there. And here's the part that matters most. Both outcomes are success. Because the moment you stop over-explaining, you stop auditioning for emotional safety, you stop convincing, you stop proving, you let your presence be optional, but not free. And that's when you finally see the truth of the connection, not through words, not through promises, but through action or absence. That's the line where avoidance either rise or quietly disappear. If someone disappears and returns to full access, they didn't miss you. They tested you. This is one of the quiet patterns that keeps people stuck with avoidance far longer than they should be. It doesn't look harmful on the surface. There's no yelling, no dramatic breakups, just distance followed by return. And when they come back, they're met with warmth, openness, and full emotional access, as if nothing happened to the person offering it. This feels mature, understanding, secure, but to an avoidant, it teaches something very specific. Avoidants learn patterns fast, not because they're manipulative, but because they're hyper-attuned to emotional safety. And distance followed by immediate forgiveness teaches them one thing: connection is optional. They don't need to stay present to remain connected. They don't need to communicate to maintain access. Silence carries no cost. This is why avoidance becomes a habit, not a conscious decision, but a learned rhythm. When things feel intense, they pull back. When they feel lonely or regulated again, they return. And because access is restored instantly, the nervous system learns that withdrawal works. The boundary here is not anger. Anger actually keeps the cycle alive. Emotional reactions still signal attachment. What disrupts avoidance is consistency. If they go quiet, you don't punish, you don't guilt, you don't send long messages asking what happened, and you don't perform understanding in hopes they'll stay. Instead, you adjust availability. Same tone, less access. You're still calm, still respectful, still grounded, but you're no longer fully open in the same way. You don't resume deep emotional conversations immediately. You don't prioritize them over your own rhythm. You don't offer closeness on demand. This is where many people get confused. They think boundaries mean coldness. They don't. Boundaries mean alignment. Your level of access matches their level of presence. And this is what breaks the pattern. Avoidants rely on distance to regulate. Withdrawal gives them relief from emotional intensity. But when distance no longer provides relief and instead costs them closeness, the system changes. Silence stops feeling safe. For the first time, they experience a consequence that isn't explosive, isn't dramatic, and isn't emotional. It's structural. The relationship no longer expands automatically after contraction. This creates discomfort, not because they're being controlled, but because the old pattern no longer works. They can't disappear and return to the same emotional environment they left. The door isn't slammed, but it's no longer wide open. And that moment matters because now the avoidant has to decide whether connection is worth the effort of staying present, whether intimacy requires participation, whether closeness can exist without disappearance. Some avoidants adjust. They communicate more, they stay a little longer in discomfort, not perfectly, but differently. Because now presence maintains connection, not distance. And others don't. They drift further away, not out of spite, but because the relationship no longer regulates them the way it used to. And again, both outcomes are clarity. When you stop rewarding distance with access, you stop being the stabilizer for someone else's nervous system. You stop absorbing the cost of their avoidance. You allow the relationship to reflect reality instead of potential. This boundary doesn't force anyone to stay. It simply removes the illusion that they can leave without losing anything. And that's the shift. Avoidance only feels safe when it's consequence-free. The moment distance costs closeness, the pattern either evolves or collapses. Either way, you stop participating in your own disappearance. Boundaries fail when they sound like criticism instead of clarity. This is where most people unintentionally sabotage their own boundaries with avoidance. They think they're being honest, but what they're really doing is making the boundary about the person instead of the standard. And for an avoidant, that distinction is everything. Avoidants shut down when they feel blamed, not because they don't care, but because blame activates defensiveness. The moment a boundary sounds like an accusation, their nervous system shifts into self-protection. They stop listening for meaning and start scanning for threat. At that point, the conversation is no longer about connection. It's about escape. But avoidants respond differently to structure. Structure feels impersonal, predictable, contained. It doesn't demand an emotional performance. And that's why they listen when they hear standards instead of criticism. There's a subtle but powerful difference between saying you never show up and saying I don't stay in connections where consistency is uncertain. The first invites debate. The second ends it. When you name the person, you invite defense. They can explain, justify, minimize, or counter. They can talk about stress, timing, and tensions, or how they're trying. Suddenly, you're back in a loop of words with no change in behavior. But when you name the standard, there's nothing to argue with. You're not diagnosing them. You're not demanding they change. You're not asking them to become more emotionally available or less avoidant. You're simply stating the environment you will remain in. And that's what makes it effective. Standards shift the focus from who they are to what the connection requires. This removes emotional pressure while increasing accountability. It quietly communicates, this is the level where I stay. What you do with that is up to you. And here's the part that feels uncomfortable for many people. Standards don't come with persuasion. You don't explain them. You don't justify them. You don't soften them, so they're easier to swallow. You state them once, calmly. cleanly. Because the power of a standard isn't in how well it's explained, it's in how consistently it's upheld. Avoidance often expect boundaries to come with negotiation. They're used to emotional conversations that end in compromise without real change. So when you name a standard and stop talking, it creates tension, not dramatic tension, but internal tension, the kind that forces a decision, and that decision is unavoidable. An avoidant facing a clear standard has only two options. They either rise to it or they walk away. Rising to it doesn't always look like grand gestures. It looks like consistency, presence, small but steady adjustments in behavior. It looks like staying when it's easier to disappear. Walking away doesn't always come with an explanation. Often it's silent, gradual. They fade instead of confront, not because the standard was unreasonable, but because meeting it would require a version of themselves they're not ready to access. And here's the most important truth in all of this. When someone walks away from a standard, they're not rejecting you. They're rejecting the level of responsibility the connection requires. Naming the standard protects you from self-betrayal. It prevents you from shrinking your needs into something more digestible. It stops you from becoming more flexible than is healthy just to keep someone comfortable. And it gives you clarity without conflict. Because when you stop telling someone what they're doing wrong and start stating what you will and won't participate in, you remove the emotional chaos from the equation. What's left is choice. And choice always reveals the truth, quietly. An avoidant doesn't fear commitment, they fear conversations they can't control. This is why chasing closure with an avoidant almost always backfires. It feels like the mature thing to do. You want understanding, resolution, a clean ending, or a renewed beginning. So you asked to talk, and then you talk again and again, each time hoping that the right words, the right tone, the right emotional honesty will finally land. But closure talks don't create clarity with avoidance. They create comfort. Why? Because closure conversations give avoidance something they value deeply: control. They get to manage the narrative, regulate the emotional temperature, and exit on their own terms. They can explain just enough to ease guilt without changing behavior. They can sound self-aware without being accountable. And every time you reopen the conversation, you teach them that words are enough. This is why avoidance survives so long in almost relationships. There's constant discussion, reflection, and emotional processing, but no structural change. The avoidant stays comfortable because nothing is required beyond conversation. The boundary here is simple, but not easy. No repeated conversations without changed behavior. That means you don't ask again. You don't circle back with a softer approach. You don't reopen the wound to see if they feel differently now. You don't schedule another talk, hoping for a different outcome. You observe. Observation is the most threatening thing to an avoidant because observation removes their ability to manage perception. They can't talk their way out of a pattern that's being quietly noted instead of emotionally challenged. When you stop chasing clarity, something shifts. The avoidant loses access to your emotional energy without earning it. They no longer get relief through explanation alone. And for the first time, they feel something unfamiliar: loss of control. This doesn't look dramatic. There's no confrontation, no ultimatum, no emotional speech. It's subtle. Conversations become shorter. Your availability changes. You stop seeking reassurance. You stop initiating "where are we" talks. And that's when truth surfaces. Because without your questions guiding the narrative, behavior becomes the message. Presence or absence says everything words were covering up. Many people fear this stage because it feels like letting go, but in reality, it's letting reality speak. It's allowing the connection to reveal itself without interference. Avoidants often rely on ambiguity. It gives them flexibility without commitment. Closure conversations prolong ambiguity under the illusion of progress. They make it feel like something is happening even when nothing is changing. When you stop chasing closure, ambiguity collapses. Some avoidants step forward. They sense the shift. They realize conversation alone won't maintain the connection anymore. So they act, not perfectly, but differently, because now staying connected requires consistency, not communication. And others fade quietly. They stop reaching out. They stop trying to explain, because without control over the narrative, the relationship no longer feels safe. And again, both outcomes are clarity. Closure isn't something an avoidant gives you, it's something you create by refusing to participate in cycles that go nowhere. You don't need one last conversation to know the truth. You need to stop interrupting. The moment you stop asking for answers, you stop giving them space to hide. And what remains, effort or distance, is the only closure that ever mattered. That's when you finally see the connection for what it is, not through words, but through what happens when you stop chasing them. The boundary that terrifies avoidance most is the one you don't announce. This is the final boundary, and the one most people never fully reach. Not because they don't understand it, but because it requires something deeper than words. This boundary isn't spoken, it's embodied, and avoidance sense it immediately. This isn't about ultimatums. Ultimatums still center the other person. They say, please choose me or else. Avoidance can feel the fear underneath that request, and fear keeps them in control. What actually disrupts avoidance is internal certainty, the quiet decision that you will be okay, regardless of the outcome. The moment you truly accept the possibility of losing them, your energy shifts, not dramatically, not performatively, subtly. And that subtle shift is what changes everything. You stop waiting for messages that may or may not come. You stop hovering in emotional limbo. You stop scanning for signs, tone, or timing. You stopped signaling fear through overavailability or overpatience. And avoidants feel that immediately. Because for the first time, they're no longer deciding the pace of the connection. They're no longer the one who pulls back while you stay steady and available. The invisible imbalance that kept the relationship afloat disappears. You are no longer orienting around their nervous system. You're orienting around your own. This is what avoidants fear, not abandonment, but irrelevance. Not loss, but loss of control. When you become willing to lose them, you remove the leverage that avoidance depends on. And here's the paradox. This is often the exact moment they become more present. Some avoidants sense the shift and step forward, not with declarations, but with effort. They reach out more consistently, they stay engaged longer, they test less, because now access to you is no longer guaranteed. But others don't. Some disappear completely. And this is where many people misinterpret what happened. They think the boundary failed. They think being willing to lose them caused the loss. But the truth is, the loss was always there, just postponed by your willingness to tolerate imbalance. When someone disappears because you stopped waiting, they didn't leave because you became distant. They left because you stopped compensating. This boundary doesn't push people away. It reveals who is only staying because you are making it easy. Being willing to lose them is not emotional detachment. It's emotional alignment. It's choosing self-respect over hope that isn't supported by action. And avoidants know the difference. They can feel when someone is still waiting underneath their calm. They can feel when someone is still afraid to lose them, but they can also feel when that fear is gone. When you've made peace with the outcome, when your presence is offered, not extended indefinitely. That's when the relationship is forced into truth. Either they step forward into responsibility, presence, and effort, or they disappear completely. Both outcomes are clarity, because the moment you stop fearing loss, you stop participating in half connections. You stop negotiating for crumbs of intimacy. You stop confusing potential with reality. And what remains is clean. No chasing, no guessing, no emotional debt, just reality. And reality is the only thing that can sustain a real connection. Everything else was already gone. Boundaries don't make avoidants leave. They reveal whether they were ever capable of staying. This is the truth that reframes everything. Most people believe boundaries are risky, that setting them will push an avoidant away, ruin the connection, or prove they asked for too much. So they soften them, delay them, compromise them. Not because the boundary isn't valid, but because they're afraid of what the boundary might expose. But boundaries don't create loss. They reveal it. Avoidants don't leave because you suddenly became difficult, demanding, or emotionally unavailable. They leave when the connection stops being shaped around their avoidance, when presence is required, when consistency matters, when intimacy is no longer optional. Before boundaries, many relationships with avoidance survive on imbalance. One person adapts, explains, waits, regulates, holds space. The other stays comfortable, distant, and unchallenged. And as long as that imbalance remains, the connection feels possible. Boundaries disrupt that illusion. They don't accuse. They don't beg. They don't chase. They simply introduce reality into a system that was sustained by flexibility on one side only. And reality is confronting. When a boundary is set and upheld, the avoidant is no longer interacting with your hope, patience, or emotional endurance. They're interacting with your self respect, and self respect cannot be negotiated with. This is why boundaries feel like rejection to avoidance. Not because they are being pushed away, but because the relationship now asks something of them, something they may not know how to give. Consistency, presence, accountability, emotional participation. If an avoidant leaves at that point, it's not because the boundary was too much. It's because the connection was always contingent on you accepting less. Boundaries don't end relationships that were meant to last. They end relationships that were surviving on your silence. And here's the part many people struggle to accept. Someone being incapable of staying is not a reflection of your worth. It's a reflection of their capacity for closeness, for discomfort, for responsibility, for growth. Avoidants don't lack feelings. They lack tolerance for sustained emotional presence. Boundaries expose that limit. Without boundaries, avoidance can hide behind charm, chemistry, and intermittent effort. With boundaries, only behavior remains, and behavior never lies. This is why boundaries feel so final, not because they force an ending, but because they remove ambiguity. They remove the maybe. They remove the future you were imagining instead of the present you were living. What's left is truth. Some avoidants rise to it slowly, imperfectly, but intentionally. But the connection is worth the discomfort of growth, and others don't. They disappear quietly without drama because staying would require a version of themselves they haven't built yet. Both outcomes hurt, but only one keeps you stuck. Boundaries free you from confusing potential with promise. They return your focus from managing someone else's fears to honoring your own needs. They don't make you lose love. They make you stop losing yourself. And in the end, that's the only clarity that matters.